couple logistic things. I put your grades up on Moodle. One of the things I wanted to point out. So you may notice that I'm not normal. Oh well. So even though this is in treatment, I kind of have a clinical practice, which kind of involves people in stages of crisis and all that. So regular teachers are not really paid or even trained to deal with this. So that's for the people not in class, and of course, those of you who have been having challenges. So I do take work home. This is not a 40-hour work week job, but I don't try and take artificial stimulants after 6 o'clock, because who wants to be up until 3? So here's the deal. If you turn the paper in, you got full credit as stated by the syllabus, period. So your biopsychosocials, your social recons, 30 points. If you turned in the environmental scan in addition to the social recon, you got 30 points for that. That goes as extra credit. You will notice there's an extra credit section now in the grading. So if I took points off for lateness, which was a threat, not entirely empty, but most of the time I didn't bother to calculate that because dealing with too many people. So if I entered everything in Moodle, but some of you turned in assignments but are not in the grade book, therefore not enrolled. You want credit? Check to see that you're enrolled. And I can, basically work out something your paperwork-wise if you're not. But some of you are turning in assignments, you're not in the grade book. So don't exactly know what to do with that. But
I want to mention something. If people aren't in the grade book by tomorrow at 5, or aren't registered by tomorrow at 5, it may cost them $100 to register.
Right.
It's week 8.
Yes, it's week 8. So get with me. If you are not, send me an email so I can have you enrolled by tomorrow. All right, so continuing on with our research. So essentially, Wellbriety, 12-step, Nation of Islam, Black Panther Party treatment program, Afrocentric treatment systems are examples of community-defined evidence and practice-based evidence, right? So all of those arose out of grassroots community responses to addiction and related issues before there was active science. So basically, if you're looking at the time, and they're basically in response to things that are happening in the community. So one of the challenges that all those kind of things is that when Martinez et al. Are studying this, and this is relatively recent, i.e. 2007, when I met these folks, because it was nice to find that there was kind of research to talk about, all right, what about things outside of maladaptive behavior? What about things outside of cognitive behavioral therapy? What about, so they're talking things like practice-based evidence may not be generalizable or transferable. So for example, the idea that everybody should fit into a 12-step mold that's usually held mostly by people within the program, it's not scientifically sustainable, but it's not necessarily a goal of theirs to be in compliance with the science necessarily, though that could be a standard that we could look for, right? So there are effective components, and what needs to happen is to find out what the effective components are. So for example, I know people with long-term recovery, and long-term recovery is defined differently depending on which community you're in within the 12-step framework. So for example, 5 years is a long time in NA, but you're a baby in AA. And so the AA people kind of look down and 5 years, that's nothing. Well, look, it's a major accomplishment for them, considering that their drug is illegal and yours is not, and you enjoy some kind of privilege because your drug is not illegal. So there's a whole other syndrome that goes along with basically dealing with an illegal drug. So anyway, So Martinez et al. Talk about what community-defined evidence is, and basically talking about emphasizing a bottom-up approach as opposed to the top-down approach that evidence-based practices is, because empirical data basically comes from the people in the empire that will pay for asking a particular question and having it answered in a particular way. Community-defined evidence will come out of a community's experience, and they're asking the question in a particular way, and that may or may not be replicated or talked about within the empirical science community. So community-defined evidence attempts to recognize experience, expertise, and value of existing or unacknowledged or undiscovered knowledge, undiscovered necessarily by the mainstream, that exists in communities and has for years and sometimes centuries. So the goal is to discover it, evaluate it if it's appropriate, and acknowledge or validate it as a body of knowledge or evidence that has to be proven to yield positive results. I could talk about, if you wanted to get into validating these bodies of work, there are various frameworks that you can use to kind of identify them in a scientific way. In psychology, I'm a transpersonalist. So one of the people that I use, for example, for my master's thesis was a guy named Ken Wilber, who has a construct called 3 eyes. And basically, eye of flesh, eye of reason, and eye of spirit. And basically, there are 3 different modes of apprehending data that may or may not relate to each other. Should I go on? Okay. All right. So, Ken Wilber. So it's transpersonal psychology, Greek letter psi. 3 eyes. So, eye of flesh. So the eye of flesh is basically empirical science. No, empirical science. Empire, the science of the empire. Okay? The empire is concerned with things you can touch. Okay? You can touch and measure. The eye of reason or mind. Okay, this is theories. All right, so for example, these tables are measured in English. Inches, feet. Maybe metric. So the worldview of English measurements. Some king had a foot that was that big, that's why it's a foot, right? Kilometers, meters, and millimeters are basically units that are found physically measuring the earth, not somebody's foot. Earth is theoretically constant, that's why the metric system. Right? So eye of reason, eye of flesh, you can measure it, you can touch it. Eye of reason basically is things like the Pythagorean theorem. Okay, so as an example, you don't find the Pythagorean theorem in nature. You don't see it. But you might use it to measure distance. Right? So numbers don't exist in nature. but we use them to count. So I have reason, I have mind, is used along with the I of flesh, which measures physical things. I of mind is theories about what you've measured. Why is this so? Okay, so for example, with neurotransmitter theory, we cannot observe neurotransmitters in action. We cannot. It happens instantaneously. And we are not designed to see things that happen in no time. All we can measure is before and after. And then we theorize that something is happening in the interim, but that thing is happening instantaneously. So neurotransmitter theory is a theory that we have basically made up, but we've tested it, so we can say that it's real, right? And so if you test it and you get the same result and I test it and I get the same, okay, we can agree that it's real. So each one of these I's has a strand in which we can say, if you want to know this, do this. And there's more to that, and I actually have slides for it, but not in this section. But it occurred to me in terms of all this talk about science, well, how would you validate something works? Okay, like if you were going to do psychedelic therapy, because there are people that have done psychedelic therapy, usually in Europe, like with people who are dying. Well, how do you do that? Well, you have to have tripped before. But Western medical science says, well, a scientist that uses themselves as a guinea pig is crazy. You wouldn't do that. That was actually an argument I had with my dad, saying, okay, wait, you're giving people Thorazine? Have you ever taken Thorazine? He says, I'm not crazy, but it causes tardive dyskinesia and all these really bad side effects. How could you see? And I was coming from an underground economy, LSD babysitters. You trip first with a babysitter, and then if somebody is taking it for the first time, you trip with them, so they don't have a bad trip. Basically, following the rules from experimental psychology of set and setting. Okay? Working off of the theory that with LSD in particular and psychedelics in general, your mindset at the time of taking the drug is amplified by the drug because of how the drug works, by basically a working theory of how the drug works. So we give you, we let you trip in a laboratory condition, we can control those variables, and we can control and program your trip, which does work for some substances. That's hence psychedelic therapy, which is not legal in this country, which is why most of that work happened in Europe. Question?
So set and setting is an eye of reason.
Yeah, right.
Isn't psychedelic therapy used to be legal?
It was before 65 in this country. Yeah. If you want to know more about that, Stan Grof has written some great books about that. Stanislav Grof. He's Czech, Freudian in orientation, so he did a lot of the work with, cancer patients in Czechoslovakia. And, when they first discovered LSD, they were basically looking for a drug in laboratory conditions that could drive you crazy. And the initial name for this class of drugs was psychomimetic. That is, it mimics psychosis. They had various theories about what makes you crazy. So what is schizophrenia? Breakdown in dopamine? What? We don't know. A shattering traumatic experience? That's theorizing, again, I have reason, that you have a singular consciousness that can be shattered, and that you're trying to put the pieces back together, and sometimes those pieces split off into split personalities. That's where that language comes from. Basically, that working knowledge that, how do we explain this? That's coming from from Western psychology, singular consciousness kind of framework. So set and setting. Set is your mind and emotion, your mental and emotional set. The setting is the physical setting. Drug amplifies them. You can control for them. All right, so if you want to know this, do this. So the third eye of spirit or contemplation okay? Basically, it's direct experience that transcends the first two eyes. In fact, okay, so eye of flesh, eye of reason, you're using words, you're using numbers. All right? So Albert Einstein once said, everything that counts can't be counted. Everything that can be counted, not everything that can be counted, counts. So he's talking about, all right, how do you explain direct intuition? How do you know that it's real? How is it validated? How do you share a spiritual experience or an experience that goes beyond what you can touch or what you can theorize about? How do you know that's real?
So like two people tripping, how can they see the same exact thing when they're not even talking?
There's that, right? Because within Western psychology, telepathy doesn't exist. That's one. Faith, right? Religious faith, a spiritual experience. Freud thinks you're crazy. Did you see an angel or not? Do you have guardian angels or not? You know, can you communicate with the dead or not? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do you know? How do you compare those experiences? Especially if you notice, because this is one of the things that Ken is talking about, because he's a Buddhist, among other things into Zen. So, all right, how do you know about various degrees of enlightenment? How do you know that somebody's enlightened and how are they not? Andre, ask me, what's the difference between a madman and a saint?
What's the difference between a madman and a saint?
They may see exactly the same thing, and the madman may speak on it like, "Rah!" But the saint knows who not to talk to and precisely what to say to whom, even if that's nothing. But the madman does, right? So, boundaries and understanding and being able to see into somebody so that you can basically say the right thing. So if I say, in terms of looking at you doing this work and relating it to diction, because you know I'm not really into talking about something unless I know that it works. You have to look into and look at the suffering addict in the middle of their worst addiction or detox and see the recovered person and talk them to that place, recognizing that the recovered person is already there. They're not actually going anywhere, but they have to take those steps. And it's hard and it's scary, and you talk them through it, knowing that they may screw up. Now, if you're operating from a framework of compassion, okay, look, you can actually learn from your relapse, but you can't keep relapsing because some relapses will kill you. All right, so I can tolerate the relapse, but I'm not giving you permission to use. It's better if you don't use. But if you do, then I'll go for a harm reduction approach until we can work you up to not using. But if you keep relapsing, you're getting, depending on what the drug is, you might be pushing the level at which the next time you use might kill you. So you want to look at that. So for example, then to be able to talk about a relationship with death, which is not necessarily in the framework of the first two eyes, because death is a out-of-body experience. How do you measure it? I had a quantum physicist. So when I've talked about, okay, this is a quantum, not this. This is a quantum device, right? The basic science for cell phones existed and was discovered 150 years ago. But we had to go through wired telephones to get to a wireless phone. So she was basically telling me, okay, so you know that film 21 grams? Yeah, right. So somebody gets executed and there's a 21 gram weight loss, which is just under an ounce, right? So wait, it's not the fluid, it's not their breath. What is it? They're alive and then they die and then they're 21 grams lighter. Like, okay, what weight loss? Because in our physics framework, energy doesn't weigh anything. So what is the energy when not present in the body animates the body? Well, that's not even a question that can be asked from our contemporary physics. She pointed out, just like with quantum science, which is the study of energy, we're about 150 years from discovering life energy. Once we're able to do that, then we can not only determine what animates a body, but she said, dare I say, we could identify an individual soul that's animating a body and track it from incarnation to incarnation, which is like already out there to me. But trying to believe at least 6 impossible things before breakfast, I gamely tried. All right, so eye of spirit or contemplation, direct experience that transcends the first two eyes. Basically, how you validate it is if two people have the same experience and they compare notes. And there are enough experiences like that so that you basically can confirm notes. And so there are, things as, prosaic as spiritual experiences, orgasm, whatever, right? You have to basically have the experience to be able to impart the experience and be able to describe what it is. And you might not be able to do it logically through either of these first two eyes. But it can still be real. Right? So hence, as an example, I'm talking about the psychedelic experience. This is where you have to be experienced with a psychedelic to walk somebody through a psychedelic experience. Because there are certain things where, just putting it in raw drug terms, being drunk is different than being stoned. But if you've never been stoned, you have no referent. The psychological term for it in the eye of reason is a referent. Okay, which is basically a psychological object. Okay, eraser. Knowing what an eraser is, I can tell you certain drug experiences may not erase the memory, but it might be hard to access the memory. So it's almost as if it got erased. All right? Table, chair, floor, ceiling, wall. These are referents. You have to push through the door. Well, you have to know what a door is. Okay? Psychological objects. So, drunk, that's a referent. Stoned, it's a referent. Psychedelic. Okay, I can tell you that LSD is different than marijuana. But if you never dropped LSD or taken a psychedelic, you have no referent for that. If I say my one-time ketamine experience, basically, taken with a psychedelic guide with, basically a program trip, I can say that ketamine for me was to LSD what LSD is to pot, which doesn't really explain the experience. But once was enough. Because the part that I could put into words sounds crazy. And that's part of the eye of spirit or contemplation. You try and explain the experience, it sounds crazy or paradoxical. You can't really put it into words. It's beyond words. My ketamine experience was basically like experiencing eons of time in 45 minutes. Dying 1,000 times. Like, have you ever been on the bus and you've seen somebody that, kind of looks interesting to you? On ketamine, I had a complete life with those people. In 45 minutes. Like literally complete life. So dying thousands of times. Violently, in bed, in old age, accidents, all that kind of stuff. Now that sounds crazy. Like, how can you do that in 45 minutes? Well, didn't seem like 45 minutes on the drug. It was timeless. It helped actually get rid of my fear of death. In a way that, coming close to dying multiple times did not. Didn't end my risk-taking behavior, but, we were young and stupid then. Becoming a parent grows you up. That it doesn't make any sense until you're a parent. So. All right, so using that framework, because basically how I applied it was basically saying, okay, I need to be able to write this master's thesis in psychology by explaining how the thesis is on the use of music as a healing art, the performer psychological viewpoint. So I could go through the eye of flesh and reason, and I could play a piece of music, but in 1976, we didn't have personal computers. Computers were the size of this room. So I could have hooked up an audience, 30 people or more, with 16 channels of EEG while I played music, but we didn't have the computer power to gather all that data. And would that actually prove that it's healing music anyway? It was much simpler to basically interview musicians and say, okay, what is your framework? What is your eye of flesh? What key are you tuning in? Which becomes an interesting question if you're Ravi Shankar or Ali Akbar Khan and you're tuning to the crickets, because the crickets are vibrating at a particular frequency, which, Western note might be D flat. And you're playing an evening raga, which is a particular scale. And that's your framework. So there's 18 quarter tones or semitones in Indian music and only 12 in Western music. How do they relate? Is a Bach piece healing? Is the Rolling Stones healing? Is it Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love? African drumming? Whose framework do you use to compare? Right? There's no empirical framework that did them all. And basically at the time in the 70s, the only way you were doing healing music was as therapy for developmentally disabled kids and adults. I was working with quote unquote normal populations. There was no work being done on that. That was the beginning of so-called new age healing relaxing music. So that's who I interviewed, right? So had to use a Ken Wilber's construct to basically explain what we're doing. So part of using a framework like Wilber, and there's other people that you can use frameworks with, I just found that one in particular to be useful because it was relatively easily accessible. In terms of looking at this idea of turning grassroots experience into replicable science and then developing a program. So part of the problem, the cultural challenges related to using evidence-supported treatments and evidence-based treatments. For example, even though it's scientific, those ESTs or EBTs do not include children of color in their norming and standardizing samples, or they do not have large enough samples to demonstrate validity, reliability, or effectiveness with children of color. The only reason that you have this is now you have research of color saying, now we're going down into the data and we're saying, this ain't even talking about us. Or if it is, they're not getting a clue. You know, Rico and Dave with their risk-focused prevention, you know, noticing that, oh, well, the longer, you know, kids of color, particularly African-American kids, in school use drugs less than white kids, but the longer they remain in the school system, the more their use goes up, but it's still below white kids. Doesn't reach a problematic level until, like high school. And then if they get in trouble, they don't get treatment, which the data wasn't actually capturing either. So as an example, that's a blind spot. So most youth have multiple diagnoses, and most ESTs, EBTs are developed for a single diagnosis. So it's as if you're a middle or upper class person, well, you've got money to shield you from certain consequences. If you're lower class, you have more risks. And that was why, you know, towards the end of, the other day I was saying, right, there are some people whose risk level is so high it's incalculable. So there was nothing to capture how these people are making it until we started looking at constructs that said, okay, here's the experience of these folks. Let's call it resiliency. Resiliency isn't necessarily the absence of risk. There might be a high risk, but so most ESTs, EBTs fail to identify the real world context, that is the ecological, contextual variables, such as socioeconomic status that facilitates or reduces their effectiveness. We know cultural contexts are very different between and within ethnic, racial, and cultural groups. All right, so to one of the topics of the week. Now, how this is defined: addiction, severity, and treatment intensity. The seriousness of, clinically it's defined as the seriousness of a client's symptoms and degree of impairment. So clinicians use severity to determine levels of care appropriate to the needs of the client. Now, one of the challenges that you find often in doing this work is that often clinicians lag in what's happening on the street. Definitely researchers do. They're thinking that people are more normal like them, and they're not necessarily tuned into what's happening on the ground. Yeah.
I'm having a hard time understanding severity. So is that severity subjective to the person's life, like how it's affected them, or is there, you know what I mean? Like
That is such a great question. Keep coming with it.
Or is there like a scale that people try to use, like if you've lost your house, if you've lost your...
Oh, well,